All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we get started with this event, just a couple of quick items I want to go over. The first being that at any time during our event, you can go to the chat section where you'll be able to find links to purchase both books from our featured author, Mr. Mccormick, and our guest speaker, both. We highly encourage you to do so, and we thank you for your patronage at this time. In addition to that, if you would like to ask questions of either of our authors, we would ask for you to place them in the Q&A section, not the chat section, just to help keep everything kind of organized so that your questions don't get lost in the chat section. That said, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Ty McCormick and Nanjala Nyabola. And we are here for a book called Beyond the Sand and Sea. Beyond the Sand and Sea is an extraordinary and inspiring book for anyone searching for pinpricks of light in the darkness. Meticulously reported over 3 years, it reveals the strength of a family of Somali refugees who never lost faith in America and exposes the broken refugee resettlement system that kept that family trapped for more than 2 decades and has turned millions into permanent exiles. Ty McCormick is an editor at Foreign Affairs, the magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations, a former foreign correspondent in Nairobi, and before that in Cairo. He has reported from more than a dozen countries in Africa and the Middle East. He has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, New Republic, and National Geographic, among others. From 2015 to 2018, he served as Africa editor of Foreign Policy magazine, where he led a team of journalists that won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for a series on African migration. He is a graduate of Stanford and Oxford. Once again, he is joined in conversation today by Nanjala Nyabola. She is a writer and political analyst based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her work focuses on the intersection between technology and politics, as well as migration and human mobility. A constant traveler, she has visited over 70 countries across 4 continents. She has published numerous articles in both academic and non-academic platforms and is the author of Published Overseas, about to be published here in America, Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move and Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. Without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening and good morning if you are in Nairobi like I am. It's fantastic to be here to talk about this fantastic book that I had the privilege of reading and reflecting with for many weeks. And I'm just so excited to be part of this. Of course, congratulations to the author. Ty, publishing a book is not a small feat. It's very, very exciting to see the words come alive on the page this way. And I think that what we have before us today is an invitation to reflect and to use a human story as an entry point for thinking about one of the most pressing global challenges of our time. One of the reasons why I'm excited to be here is, both of our books deal with the idea of movement and with human beings trying to seek in the world, whether it is to seek safety, whether it is to seek opportunity, whether it is to seek even just a change of scene, or even it's just to seek difference. And I think, we're both united also by by Kenya. I spend a lot of time in my book thinking about Kenya, and I think what you have in this book, Ty, is a story about a place, about people seeking place and seeking home. And of course, Kenya is one of the places where the seeking happens. So it's very exciting to be here. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to be guiding us through this conversation with Ty, and I hope that you have questions for us. We're going to take you a little bit of a journey, I think, through our conversation, through both places, through ideas, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a sense of what a magnificent book this is, and it will be something that you will have an interest, a passion, curiosity, the subject you have a curiosity to engage with. So thank you for being with us. Good afternoon, Ty.
Good afternoon or evening. I just want to say a huge thank you to you for agreeing to moderate this and to be here. I know it's 1 o'clock in the morning where you are in Nairobi, so I owe you big time. Thank you for being here. And we're also, of course, extremely lucky to have you for other reasons too. You know, you are a leading voice, an analyst on issues of mobility and refugees and migration. And I cannot recommend your books highly enough. Both of them, you've written 2 brilliant books, but the most recent one I found to be extremely moving. I have it here, and I encourage everyone to look it up and to consider buying it. It's an extraordinary collection of essays that have real relevance today. You know, as we deal with a refugee, crisis on a global scale, migration issues, creeping into the press, and just issues of mobility in a pandemic. All of these things, I think, are illuminated in Nanjala's book. So, there's my plug for Nanjala's book. My plug for Politics and Prose comes next. I just want to say a huge thank you for having me. And independent bookstores are this real kind of linchpin of our communities, and they've really suffered during the pandemic. So I hope during the course of the conversation, if you can meander over to Politics and Prose's website, and I hope you buy my book. I hope you buy Nanjala's book, but buy another book if you would rather. And I think think about supporting a business that I think we all couldn't do without.
That's a fantastic pitch for both Politics and Prose and for my book. So thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, let's get into it. This is a conversation between friends. I've had the privilege of reading the book. I think it's fantastic. I think the storytelling is fantastic. I think the story is incredibly important. But I was wondering if we could start with an invitation to everybody who's in this call on this meeting to join us and understand and get a flavor of what kind of book it is. And maybe we could do that if you would read a little bit of a segment for us. If I could invite you to just read a couple of pages for us so that people can get a sense of the kind of book that we're talking about and the kind of storytelling that we're talking about.
Sure. I'll read a passage from the introduction, actually, that I think gives a good sense of the story and some of the scene for most of the book. As he stood in line for immigration at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Asad Hussein tried to recall the final stanza of a poem by William Ernest Henley. In front of him, over the heads of a dozen disheveled travelers, stood a row of glass cubicles marking the border of the United States. Unremarkable as it must have seemed to the other travelers that day, the sterile, fluorescent-lit gateway to America felt surreal to him. Years before, in a desert refugee camp in East Africa, he had scrawled the poem on a slab of sheet metal he used to keep the sand from blowing into his tent. Henley's words had famously sustained Nelson Mandela during his long imprisonment on Robben Island, and Asad had sought in them a similar source of inspiration. He had hoped they would strengthen his resolve to one day reach the United States. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. How many times had he read those lines, growing up a citizen of nowhere in the world's largest refugee camp? A sea of sand and thorn scrub and makeshift tarpaulin dwellings in the dry badlands of northeast Kenya, the camp had been home to more than 500,000 people at one point, a city the size of Kansas City or Atlanta, except without electricity or running water. There were no paved roads, no two-story buildings, no permanent structures of any kind. Most of the refugees had fled the war in neighboring Somalia, but a growing number, like Asad, had been born in the camp and never seen their home country. Members of this new generation had spent their entire lives in limbo, everything from food rations that kept them alive to the arcane resettlement process that offered the only hope of a better future, hinged on the whimsy of distant powers. In Dadaab refugee camp, no one is master of his fate. Yet somehow, after 32 years of waiting, Asad had made it here. In his back pocket was a UN-issued travel document that contained a student visa. Tucked inside the document's light blue jacket was a form stating the impossible. He had been admitted to Princeton University and awarded a scholarship worth $70,000. It was more than his entire family, perhaps in his entire block in Dadaab, had ever seen in their lives, and so improbable that he hadn't allowed himself to fully process what it meant. He didn't dare. Too many times he had been on the cusp of breaking free from Dadaab, only to have it re-ensnare him at the last moment. There was the promise of from the UN Refugee Agency of Resettlement in the United States that had gone unfulfilled for 13 years. The prestigious Canadian scholarship he had devoted his entire childhood to winning, only to fall short of the grade, and the desperate attempt to smuggle himself out of the camp that had ended with him behind bars. Then came an executive order from President Donald Trump that shook Dadaab like an exploding mortar shell. Just days before his parents were scheduled to interview at the US Embassy in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi, the final step in the arduous vetting process for green cards, the United States had suspended all refugee admissions and banned travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries, including Somalia. Now, as the custom line inched forward, he felt sure someone would snatch this opportunity from him as well. The Trump travel ban wasn't supposed to apply to him, since he had been born in Kenya and granted a student visa. But he knew the agents at the border had the final say on who entered the United States, and there were plenty of reasons they might turn away a 22-year-old ethnic Somali man. Already, a mysterious American official had intercepted him on his layover in Frankfurt. She had peppered him with questions, some of them surprisingly blunt. Have you ever been a member of an extremist organization? Do you know anyone who has been a member of an extremist organization? With each shuffle forward, Assad's anxiety grew. By the time he had reached the front of the line and a young Latino agent with a crew cut beckoned with a pair of raised fingers, he could feel himself freezing up, a hint of a childhood stammer creeping back into his voice. Just answer the question the way you've practiced, he told himself. Look the agent in the eye, smile. The first few questions were pro forma. What did he plan to study? Was this his first trip to the United States? The agent then swiveled in his chair and faced the computer screen. His sullen expression gave no hint as to what he was reading, but as the minutes dragged on, Assad was gradually overcome with a feeling of dread. Then, without a warning, a red light above him began to blink. Would you please come this way, said the agent, stepping out from behind his desk and gesturing to a dimly lit hallway at the end of a row of cubicles. We'd just like to ask you a few more questions.
Wow. You know, as a person who's been on that border many times, even when all your papers are in order, it's an incredibly intimidating experience. The wait, first of all, you know, trying to get to the front of the line with your mind intact, with your self, you know, the peace intact. So, you know, hearing that, there's so many different directions that I want to go, but I want to start with Dadaab. I'm a Kenyan, born and raised. I've never been to Dadaab. Dadaab is more of an idea than a physical place for a lot of Kenyans. And in my own book, I write a little bit about how Garissa, which is the biggest major town, aside from the town of Dadaab, is the next biggest town is Garissa, is on the margins of the political imagination in Kenya. You know, the way we imagine, for example, you would ask an American and they would tell you that Washington, D.C. is in the middle of the United States, when in actual fact, it's in the southeast, kind of. So the political imagination of Kenya kind of puts Dadaab at the margins of the margins of the margins. And I was just wondering, you had to go to Dadaab to do some reporting. You've been to Dadaab, you've experienced it. Just to go a little bit deeper, I guess, into the Dadaab as a place, as a character, I guess, in this book. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what your first impressions and what your lasting impressions of Dadaab were?
Sure. The margins of the margins is a beautiful way of putting it, Nanjala. Dadaab is this fascinating, complicated, and in some ways very tragic place. It's incredibly difficult to describe for people who haven't been there. In the book, I compare it to the fictional town of Macondo in 100 Years of Solitude, which is famously described as separated or cut off from the rest of civilization by measureless swamps and forbidding mountain ranges, and of course visited only intermittently by a very small number of traveling gypsies who are kind of the only people from the outside world who come to peddle their wares. Dadaab is also cut off from the outside world by this vast sort of semi-desert that extends over much of the northeast part of the country. And it's also visited by very few people from the outside world. Aid workers and journalists are sort of some of the only people that come to Dadaab. And of course, the people who live there are not free to come and go. And so they are they're essentially stranded there in what I would describe in some ways as an open prison. The aid workers and the journalists who often come by air. Whenever I've traveled to Dadaab, I've come on a UN flight. There are road links, but they're not paved and they're not terribly secure, and so they're not often used by the traveling gypsies. If we're going to continue with that analogy. And from the air, Dadaab is something to behold. You travel from Nairobi and you go for more than an hour, and beneath you is just this sort of vast nothingness, this sort of arid, semi-desert, brownish, reddish soil with sort of some short trees and not a sign of humanity for really anywhere, for as far as you can see. And then you kind of cross this invisible line at some point, and then just row after row after row of tiny dwellings kind of, unfurl beneath you. And you come down to the ground and you look at these dwellings up close, and you can see that they're made kind of haphazardly from, twigs and thorn scrub and, some leftover tarps from the UN, maybe a slab of sheet metal. Some of the refugees make their own bricks out of sand. And then you realize that this camp has been like this, the same way for 3 decades. This is a camp that was set up in 1992, 1 year after Somalia collapsed into civil war, and hundreds of thousands of people fled to Kenya. And now here we are, 30 years later, with a second and a third generation of refugees growing up under this largely the same conditions with largely the same limitations on what they're able to do.
Yeah. It's exactly like you said, it's something that has been here certainly almost as long as I can remember, as long as I've been aware of the news. I've been aware of situations. Dadaab has always been there, has always just been something that comes up, but it's not a place that we go. It's not a place that we think about. And I think even for most Kenyans, it's not a place that we really imagine, because we just don't think about it in the way that we think about other places. And I'm also curious about your two central characters, the brother-sister pair, Marianne and Assad. What is it about this family that drew you to them as characters? What is it about their stories or their experiences or even their personalities that sort of drew you to them as a writer?
I mean, so many things, but I would say that the initial thing that stood out to me and that inspired me in some ways, and in other ways I found just devastating, was the length of their odyssey. I mean, this is a family that has been separated for several decades and has been in search of a country to call home for 3 decades now. And so it was that odyssey, and also the incredible strength and sort of the bond between these two siblings that so inspired me to write the book. We were talking about this a little bit in our call yesterday, but I've always felt that refugee and immigrant stories are the epics of our time. The courage, the bravery that so often people who are forced from their homes as a result of war or persecution, and the sacrifices that they make for their families, just to be given, the safety and the opportunities that so many of us take for granted, I think is heroic in a Homeric sense. The filmmaker Deborah Eskenazi said it really beautifully, I thought, when she said that refugees and migrants must face all of the monsters with the help of none of the gods. It took Odysseus 10 years to get home from the Trojan War, and the odyssey of the family that I write about in the book is still ongoing after 30 years. So that gives you sort of some idea of the strength that this family has. I think, one of the things that made me write the book was really something that I stumbled upon long before I met Assad and Marian. And it was a simple statistic about the length of refugee crises that just absolutely floored me. I think a lot of people have a sense of the scale of the refugee crisis. In 2015, when the crisis was happening in the Mediterranean and refugees were in the news, I think people understood that many millions of people had been displaced because of war. Some people even understood that it was more people than at any time since World War II. The thing that I think was missed, and that still gets missed, is how long people are being displaced for. There's a categorization of displacement crisis. The UN calls it protracted refugee crises. And roughly speaking, the definition is a crisis that lasts for more than 6 years and doesn't have an immediate prospect of being resolved. But the average year, and this is the statistic that really got me, the average year for one of these crises, or average length for one of them in the mid-1990s, was 8 years. Fast forward to today, the average length for one is 26 years. So in the span of a quarter century, these kinds of crises just got frozen in time. There was virtually no resolution to them. And I think that the situation in Dadaab and on the other side of Kenya in Kakuma, which is largely an outgrowth of the conflict in South Sudan, they're both pretty good examples of these kinds of conflicts that are dragging on and have been dragging on since the early 1990s, and that have resulted in just sort of permanent limbo. And I describe it as permanent exile in the book. I think it's a very unscientific term, but I think it speaks to what it actually means for the people who are living in places for generations and belong to no country.
Yeah. That actually tees off my next question really well, because I call it the age of encampment. This whole thing that's happened that you're mentioning, whereby we have millions of people around the world currently stuck in this political exile, in this limbo, where there is no forward and there is no back. There is no home. There is no sense of, permanence that comes from citizenship, that comes from belonging to a specific political entity. And of course, there was a time that Dadaab was the largest refugee camp in the world. That is no longer the case. In fact, it is dwarfed by numerous refugee camps that have arisen in the last 15 years, I would say. Zatari in Jordan, you're talking about millions of people. Camps in Pakistan with Afghani refugees, you're talking about millions of people. And it, exactly as you said, symbolizing this political stalemate that has come into play in the last 25 years, whereby we are getting very good at starting wars. We have not gotten any better at stopping them. And so this mass exodus of people from conflict zones continues, but there is no way. In fact, it's become harder and harder for these people to find home and to find place. How does a place like Dadaab impact? How does this permanent sense of encampment and you talk a little bit about the book, so it's really just an invitation to share this with the audience. How does this interminable encampment, this never-ending encampment, affect a person like Assad, who is, the camp sort of becomes part of a permanent part of their lives? Like, how does that work? How does that feel? What does that look like on a human level?
It's really complicated, Nanjala, because on the one hand, it's easy to say these camps are a disgrace. They are, to our great shame as human beings, that we sentence people to live in conditions like this. On the other hand, they're home to people, and there's a unique culture that has taken hold in Dadaab that is different than the culture in Somalia. It's different than the culture in the rest of Kenya. And there's a lot that people, I think, value about it. It's not as simple as saying that we should shut them down, which of course is what the Kenyan government has done yet again, which is, the way that the Kenyan government goes about this from time to time is incredibly destructive and is very destabilizing to the people that live in the camps. I covered this story in 2017. It's actually why I traveled to Dadaab for the first time as a reporter. was one of these periodic times when the Kenyan government threatens to close the camp and expel its hundreds of thousands of refugees and send them back to Somalia, where there are at a minimum many fewer social services for the people living in the camps. There are no aid agencies that are operating anywhere close to the scale that they're operating in Dadaab. And in other parts, it's just not safe. The conflict is still ongoing. There's vast swaths of the country that are under al-Shabaab's control. But those, whenever the Kenyan government threatens to do this, there is, of course, an understandable backlash, from refugees that say, hey, this is home, don't close the camp. I want to remain here. And I think that speaks to the sense that that people do feel a sense of belonging in the camp, even though they long for a more permanent, place, whether that's resettlement or whether that would be just greater rights within Kenya. I think at the end of the day, you're right that we need to find a better way of finding refugees home. You wrote a beautiful essay in Foreign Affairs called "The End of Asylum," and I think that is, in many ways, that's the root of the problem. The problem is that countries are closing their borders, they're drawing up their drawbridges, and they are saying no more. And that's what leads to the age of encampment.
Yeah. And of course, you've touched on something that's really important, which is the responsibilities that other countries have. So we talk a lot about the host countries, but the host countries, Kenya has this horrible reputation lately of announcing that they're going to close the camp, the quote unquote voluntary returns, which are far from voluntary for a lot of people. But then there are other countries that are implicated in this, the countries that are paying to, the United States is paying Kenya to fight this war in Somalia. And you have countries that are funding military activities in different parts of the world. And I think that to me, there's a little bit of a responsibility there, right? To me, there's like a little bit of a responsibility for if your tax money is going to start a war, to sustain a war halfway around the world. For me, there's a sense of, well, don't you want to know what your money is going towards? Don't you want to know what your taxes are going towards? Don't you want to know what the consequences of those political decisions are going to be? But in your reading, in your assessment, do you think that people in the United States understand what their tax money, the political situations that their tax money is creating, in places like Kenya, places like Somalia? And just again, you and I both worked on these issues for a long time. I remember when Barack Obama came to Kenya and everybody was talking about how it's so great and it's a homecoming and whatever. And I wrote an op-ed and I was questioning US military expenditure in Kenya. And one of the first many agreements that he signed was selling $9 million worth of weapons to the Kenyan government. And knowing that Kenya being Kenya, that money was going towards the war in Somalia, that money was going towards that conflict, even if there wasn't any money that was going into Dadaab. So, people on this call are Americans and they're American taxpayers. And what would you want them to understand about the place of the United States in this, both the creation and in the sustaining these conflicts, but also towards people like Assad and Marian? What is the United States doing and what's the situation right now? What would you want them to know?
Yeah, I think there's responsibility on both ends, as you rightly point out, that America does have a role in the conflict in Somalia. I think you can debate the merits of the counterterrorism operations that are underway in Somalia right now. What I think is less easy to debate is just how destructive the US-backed Ethiopian invasion was in 2006, that dislodged what was a government called the Islamic Courts Union, which was ideologically, I think it's fair to say, was aligned something close to what al-Shabaab is like now, but maybe not quite as extreme, and not certainly not outwardly focused on projecting terrorism elsewhere. But I think in the aftermath of 9/11, the US had a hammer and everything looked like a nail. And that was the case in Somalia, that there was this fear that it would become a hotbed of terrorism. Well, it did become a hotbed of terrorism largely because the US backed an Ethiopian invasion that swept through, created incredible suffering and displaced an enormous number of people, many of whom ended up in Dadaab. The responsibility on the other end, I think, is that the US funds quite a lot of UNHCR's budget and the humanitarian relief that goes to keep people alive in places like Dadaab. But they're also working with the Kenyan government to try to close down the camp. And I did a story in 2017 about US funding for the voluntary repatriation program you referenced, the so-called VolReps, which is in short, basically that the UN agency that is in charge of refugees offers refugees an incentive to go home. It's a tiny incentive. It's maybe $500, a mat to sleep on, maybe a SIM card for your phone that allows them to follow up with you once or twice, and off you go back to Somalia. And I went back to Somalia and followed up with families that had taken this opportunity and had ended up homeless on a beach outside of Kismayu, which is a city in southern Somalia. And of course, many of these people end up fleeing back to Dadaab, except for that this time around, they're outside of the UN system because they've given up their refugee status. So they live in Dadaab, unable to get the meager food rations that the UN disperses. So the American taxpayer has responsibility on all of those fronts. I would say that the taxpayer also has an enormous opportunity. I think that refugee resettlement was such a powerful soft power tool for this country, or for, I say this country, but for the United States. The amount of goodwill that resettling refugees generates is staggering. And you travel to these places and people speak about the United States, and this Assad, the protagonist of the book, or one of the protagonists of the book, writes himself that people in Dadaab spoke about the United States like they speak about the hereafter. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that people have a higher opinion of the United States oftentimes before they are resettled to the United States than they do when they get to the United States, because it's not just that the United States is this idea of this land of opportunity. It's the generosity of extending a place, to people who are stranded, and a lot of that was lost in the last 4 years. I would say most of that was lost. I traveled to Dadaab in 2019 as part of the research for this book, and on my last day there, I was getting ready to get on my UN flight to go home, and there was this family, and they were getting resettled. There was one single family getting resettled. And they were going to the United Kingdom. They weren't going to the United States. And I just kept thinking to myself, this family, this is the most important day of this family's life. They will look back on this day for the rest of their lives and think, wow, what an amazing thing that this country that I have no connection to did for me. The United Kingdom opened its borders and gave me a new home. And I just kept thinking, what a loss for the United States that used to be the leader in refugee resettlement, has resettled 3 out of 4 refugees resettled anywhere in the world since 1980, and then just shut it all down and kind of threw it away over the last 4 years.
And shut it down in such a abrupt way. These executive orders that come with very little notice, that have these sweeping implications. I mean, we saw when the executive order or the so-called Muslim ban came down, you had families where people had gone home for the holidays, couldn't go back to their graduate programs, people who couldn't see ailing grandparents. I mean, the human implications of these executive orders is tremendous. And of course, right now with the Dadaab, you're stuck between 2 sets of these executive orders. So you have the US making these orders that the Biden administration has promised to overturn. We're still waiting to see how that goes. And then you have the Kenyan government every 2 years announcing that everybody's going back, everything is getting shut down. You've alluded to this before, but maybe tell us a little bit more about the implications of some of these summary orders, these, close down the camps in 30 days, everybody's going back in 30 days, nobody's coming in 30 days. From a human perspective, from, the Assad, Marian, and all of the people in Dadaab, what does that look like? What does that feel like to be on the other end of these summary declarations?
I think it's hard to overstate the harm of Trump's refugee policies. The Trump travel ban and the temporary pause on refugee resettlement were just catastrophic in places like Dadaab. I mean, Dadaab was, it's arguably the case that Dadaab was more affected by Trump's travel ban on a per capita basis than anywhere else in the world. There were 14,000 people in Dadaab at some stage of the resettlement process in January 2017 when Trump's travel ban came down. And overnight, the entire, the vetting stopped, the issuing of visa stops, the flights stopped, the entire humanitarian apparatus designed essentially to give people new lives ground to a halt overnight. In 2018, a total of 8 people from Dadaab were resettled to the United States, and the next year, just 14 people. People who had life-threatening illnesses were turned away. Many people died who were in line to be resettled. So it's not a temporary inconvenience. It's not like, oh, you can just come back later or wait it out or whatever. Like, these are life-changing, life-altering, sometimes life-ending decisions that get made by these sort of distant, faceless bureaucrats that you just get shuffled to the side and you don't, you're no longer in line to be resettled. And I think, from I've sort of lost my train of thought there of what I was trying to say about those orders. What I wanted to add was that the despair that set in afterwards, as a result of just being pushed to the side of the line. There was a spate of suicides that happened not in Dadaab, but in Kakuma, which is on the other side of Kenya. Within 16 months or so of the Trump travel ban, I think 8 or 10 people took their own lives. And I write about one of the young men who took his own life in the book. And in a lot of ways, you could see him ending up at a place like Princeton under other circumstances. The things didn't break his way. First, he was not able to get resettlement. He gave up on this idea of coming to the US. He put his sights on going to Canada, and then that fell through, and he ended up taking his own life.
Yeah, there's a saying that it sounds like a cliche, but if you think about it, it's actually incredibly important, which is, what if the cure for cancer is in the mind of someone who is stuck in one of these camps? What if the solution to so many of our problems is stuck in the mind of someone who is facing these kinds of arbitrary declarations, political declarations? And that also leads me to my next question, which is, one of the themes that really jumps out in the book is the idea of education. You talked in the section that you read about Assad and that admission to Princeton representing more than just a degree. It is opportunity. It is really crossing some kind of Rubicon and getting to the other side of something tremendous. And education, as it emerges in the book, it represents that for a lot of refugees. It's a way out. It's a way of getting something different. When I think about Assad getting into an Ivy League college, for me, I couldn't help but think about the college admission scandal, which of course now has a Netflix film. Everything has a Netflix film nowadays. So, but I couldn't help thinking about the college admission scandal and how now people in the United States are understanding how the odds can be stacked against someone. That you can have these secret sort of pitfalls and insider knowledge, everything that's stacked against you, and not knowing how to play the game can lock you out. But of course, as a refugee, Assad is dealing with this on a much more profound level, that it's starting from all the way back in Kenya and in Dadaab. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Why does education, first of all, why does it represent such opportunity? What is it about the way that the refugee education is structured that allows for it to become so important? But at the same, tied into that, I just, it's hard enough when you have all the knowledge and you have connections. Like, how does a person who is coming from a place like Dadaab, as you've described it, navigate, this journey to Princeton?
Yeah, to take these in order, I think that education has this enormous sort of place in refugee life. I think, I don't know, I mean, I'm curious what you think, but I think largely because it's one of two ways out of the camp. I think that there's resettlement, and then there is this path to win. There's a scholarship that pretty much everybody in Dadaab who's enrolled in school is trying to win, the World University Services of Canada WUSC scholarship, which just looms large over Assad's childhood and over the childhood of a lot of the people that he went to school with, and frankly, lots of other refugees that I've met over the years who have grown up in Kenyan camps. And the scholarship is, it's arguably one of the most generous scholarships in the world. It allows you not just to go to Canada and study, but to sponsor, it gives you an opportunity to sponsor your family to come with you. And so these have become kind of golden tickets, and I think that they've changed the culture. I don't think there's any debate about that. I think that, you know, you and I were talking the other day about gender imbalances and the challenges that women face in these circumstances, and how much greater those challenges are than they are for male refugees. Well, I think it's fair to say that the WUSC has changed some of that culture, because many refugee families recognize that a brilliant daughter who wins a scholarship to go to Canada might bring them with them too. And so that's an argument to let girls stay in school and to seek higher education. So I think that's part of why it looms so large. In terms of Assad's journey to Princeton, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how difficult it was for him, and how many different doors were closed and ways around them he had to find. You know, I had the privilege of living sort of through this process, because he was spending a lot of time with my wife and I. He'd become a close friend of ours. He would, you know, sometimes come home from boarding school and stay at our house. We'd been working on the book together for a long time at that point. And really he'd sort of become a friend more than anything. And so I watched him go through this insane process, and I tried to guide him a little bit to the extent that I was possible. There's a sort of funny scene in the book where he brings his SAT you know, book home, and I attempt, you know, 15 years hence from having been a middling student, to try to explain to him, you know, the analogies and whatnot, that, oh my God, I don't know how kids do it. And I was totally useless and unable to help him with the process. And, you know, he says to me, Ty, I'm pretty good at teaching myself at this point. And he makes his way through it. But that was just the beginning of this, you know, process, this process that required endless forms, endless kinds of identification, forms that ask questions like, do you have any investments or trusts, or do you have a second home or a boat? And, you know, he at one point he wrote this, one form offered him an opportunity. Most forms didn't offer any ability to sort of say, hey, like, none of this applies to me. But there was one, I think it was maybe on his financial aid application, which, by the way, costs money to fill out, that he sort of wrote this statement that said, you know, my parents are refugees, I am a refugee, I own no property, you know, please consider me for a scholarship. And, you know, I think, you know, many of the people listening in probably have, you know, children, or maybe they went through this process themselves recently, and we've kind of normalized it. We kind of assume that this is just a standard way of doing things, but the way that it's set up now is, by design, shuts out the vast majority of people all around the world. People who have just as much ability and just as much, you know, smarts. They have no chance of getting in, not because of any shortcoming on their own, but because they don't have the resources to get through it.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that you say that, because I went to law school in the US, and when I started law school and you're talking to your classmates, is when I realized how much money people spend on LSAT prep, because I just had the books. And I went, in fact, I was living in Kinshasa when I was doing my LSAT prep, and you know, the lights go out for 3-6 hours a day, and you have your textbooks, and then you show up at this place and there are people who have spent $25,000 in whatever on LSAT prep. And that's just the test. You haven't even talked about all the prep that goes into filling in the paperwork. And so when I was reading that and reflecting on that, that's kind of what I thought. I imagine even in the relative privilege of having a citizenship and having a place, it was still a nightmare to navigate and to get to the other side and realize that there are people who have so much more than you ever could even picture. And you all have to pretend that you're competing equally for the same spots. And you all have to pretend that this is some kind of egalitarian exercise. But in actual fact, it isn't. Just a quick note to remind the people who are participating, you can drop your questions in the Q&A section. We're about to get into to questions, so send them in. And before we get into that, I want to pick up on something that you just talked about, Ty, which is identity and how, we take a lot of things for granted, bureaucratic identities for granted. And this is something that I'm thinking about in my own research. It's something that I've written about in Traveling While Black, that a lot of our bureaucratic identities, categories that are defined by people who have more power over our lives, usually governments. But in the case of Assad and Mariam, it's UNHCR that is telling you, this is where your physical address is. This is what your ID number, your refugee or your ration number is. All of these bureaucratic identities are coming from a powerful place. And sometimes the institutions that we want to get into, like the colleges, like the universities, don't recognize our bureaucratic identities. On a very banal level, I'm always frustrated and amused when I'm filling in paperwork for a US organization, and they say, well, we want your address. And I say, well, my address is PO Box, da, 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 da. And they say, no, we want your real address. And I'm like, that is my real address, because in Kenya, we don't use, First Avenue, whatever, that doesn't exist. The PO Box is your real address. It's a bureaucratic marker of place that reflects the obsessions of the specific institution. And of course, as a refugee, you don't even have many of the things that we take for granted. If you're in Kenya, you don't have an ID card, you don't have a passport, you don't have, your identity is measured differently. I guess what I'm hoping, I'm inviting you to reflect on is the challenge of proving who you are, of existing, of proving before an institution that you exist. You talk a little bit about this in the book, and I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about that, because Assad and Mariam have to prove who they are and that they exist in a world that doesn't want to see refugee identities. So just talk to us a little bit about that. What refugee identity means in the context of this world that we live in.
Yeah, I think it's a thing that for many Americans is difficult even to understand, that the burden of proof, of proving that you are someone, falls on you. It's not a thing that the state necessarily bestows on you in the form of a birth certificate when you're born. If you are born in Dadaab or another refugee camp in Kenya, chances are you do not have a birth certificate. The only marker of your identity most of the time is your parents' ration card. You will get added as a sort of line item on there, where it's one of the ways that they determine how many rations you should get, is how many people are in your family and how many people do you need to feed every 2 weeks. The way that food rations are distributed in the campus is this incredibly humiliating process where people are forced to stand out for hours on end to get a few kilograms of rice or maize and then some cooking oil and maybe some salt if you're lucky. But that little, maybe there's a photograph, maybe a fingerprint, and your name and your date of birth are the only records that the state has of your existence in the refugee camp. And it's usually jointly recognized by, they keep changing the name, but I think it's the Kenya Refugee Authority and UNHCR. And they jointly are in charge of issuing a lot of these documents. And of course, they're so impersonal and so uncaring. Well, uncaring is maybe harsh, but so impersonal that they record people's birthday as the first of the year. You just report that you've had another kid, and they say, well, okay, January 1, 1988 or whatever. that's your birthday. And so then, of course, any official document that you have for the rest of your life, most likely, because you have to use that initial document to get the next document. If you are lucky enough to get employment or a university opportunity, you have to take that ration card. Assad had to take the ration card, get a doctor to sign an affidavit saying he'd been born in the camp, and then there's a whole bunch of other hoops he had to jump through to get what's called a conventional travel document from the UN, which is that blue document that I described in the introduction to the piece. It looks like something you could make in your basement. It's like hand done. But I believe on that document it says his birthday is January 1, even though he's born in October. But every single one of these things, the origin of it is this impersonal, uncaring, bureaucratic sort of accident.
I wanted to sort of, I guess my last two questions, to take a step back from the content of the book and to think a little bit about the process of the book and the process of writing such a story. You said, 4 years end to end, bringing it to life and getting to know Assad and Marin and their families really intimately. What for you was the most difficult part about writing this book?
There were a lot of things that I found really challenging about writing the book. One thing I found really hard was figuring out what to do with myself. The golden rule of journalism is never to make yourself part of the story. And I tried writing this book that way, and some of the mentors that have been kind enough to share advice with me over the years gave me conflicting advice on this, and said you shouldn't feel any obligation to impose yourself on the story. And I was initially wary of overshadowing or sort of barging in where I wasn't needed. But I felt in the end that there was no honest way to tell the story without being in it, because of the relationship that I had forged, not just with Assad, but with Marion and with the whole family. And it's not purely a journalistic work. There are elements of journalism, and I tried where possible to hew to my training and my trade, and to be honest as I could be. But as I say in the introduction, I didn't feel like an impartial observer. I felt like someone who was rooting very hard for Assad to succeed. And I think, one of the things about the book is that the ending wasn't written when I started writing this book. We didn't know that Assad was going to wind up at Princeton. I was very much hoping, but also very much worrying that it would end up very differently. And so the way that I figured out a way essentially to acknowledge that in the introduction, and then step out of the frame and try to write 2 full sections of the book from the point of view of the characters, really getting as much as I could inside of their world and their head. And then stepping back into the frame in the 3rd section, and retelling the story as a kind of double chronology, where I sort of offer a little more disclosure, and then also just explain how things looked from my perspective as as the worried narrator.
Thank you. I'm going to give you we've got very little time left. I'm sorry. I just thought it was a really interesting book. So I had a lot of questions, but I'm going to take some of these questions that are in the chat. A question from Rebecca and Tom. How did this story become a book? Why, of all of the things that you've written, stories that you've reported on, did this one become a book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it became a book in part because I have always, as I said in the beginning, I sort of went in search of a story like this because I was so fascinated with the experience of extended, prolonged displacement situations. It felt like this incredible injustice that is largely invisible to so many of us, and certainly designed in such a way as to be out of sight and out of mind. Refugee crises, I think, they boil to the surface every once in a while, but then they go back to this kind of slow simmer that can be sort of safely ignored by the media, by people who are going about their everyday lives and can't bear to think about one more thing. So I wanted to tell a story like that, And then, of course, when I met Assad and Marian and their family, it became clear that that was the right family to highlight. I think another part of that is sort of just how much they became a part of my wife Jill, who's also a journalist, and our lives, and the year and a half we spent in Kenya going through this process. And I didn't have a deal to sell the book at that point. I was hoping to do so, and I'd been working on it. And I think the prolonged period that we spent going through that process, it sort of made it inevitable that it would end up as a book.
We have another question here, which is, how do you think that we can change the narrative on resettlement, or do you think we can change the narrative on resettlement of refugees?
I think we can. I think that it's remarkable how popular it is actually in the United States. I think that there's this assumption, maybe of sort of from cynical liberals, that people don't want to resettle refugees. That's just not the case. When Trump was in office, he issued, I believe it was an executive order, essentially giving communities veto power over whether or not they received refugees. It's sort of an opt-in rather than an opt-out. And I think it's very much expected, particularly red states, to say, we don't want refugees, send them to blue states. That's not what happened. Many states and many local officials who are acting in part based on polling data that shows that many Americans support refugee resettlement opted to keep resettling people. I think people have realized that they're incredible assets to the communities that they join, that, particularly in cities that have declining populations, that have declining tax bases, that are really suffering. Places, like Buffalo, New York, in the state where I live, resettle huge numbers of refugees and benefit as a result of it. Immigrants to this country start businesses at much higher rates than people who are born here. Refugees, by and large, end up paying more taxes than they receive in social services within some pretty limited amount of time. So I think that all of those things are actually better understood than many people realize or think. The holdup is largely in Washington, and I think that with the Biden administration coming in, Biden has already promised to rescind and remove a lot of the things that Trump put in place. He just hasn't really done it yet. And I think part of it is this same inability to kind of believe that Americans are smart enough to figure out what their own interests are. I think right now, I don't have any special information about what it is that the White House is thinking about, why it hasn't lifted the annual cap on refugee resettlement. But it seems clear to me as an outsider that part of the political calculus, is what's happening on the southern border. And there's this sense that Biden's going to get beat up by Republicans if he, goes and raises the cap as he has promised to do. And, this has resulted already in the State Department having to cancel 700 flights from refugees who were supposed to come, that they were anticipating they'd be able to give them a new home. And they haven't done it. And to me, it's this unwillingness of politicians in Washington to take at face value what voters are telling them. The voters are telling them, we want refugees in our communities. We want to resettle people. So I actually don't think it's as big of a challenge on that limited level to sort of restore things back to where they were. To get an actual, solution to the problem of encampment that we were talking about before, I think is a much more ambitious, but still not totally, out of the question objective. We're talking about 25 million people around the world, which is less than 0.5% of the world's population. And you got to keep in mind that the developed world has, an aging population that is going to result in tax pressures that make the welfare state unsustainable ultimately. So, they're looking at the solution. The solution is giving people a home that they need, and solving two problems at once.
Yeah. We have one last question that I'm going to take because we're right on the hour, which is, do you think and how we can have IDPs and refugees more involved and have more agency in the camp system?
Yes, and yes. I think that one of the reasons it feels the way it does to people who are there, and why it's so destabilizing and painful, is that they are by and large at the mercy of those who are there to help them, and oftentimes, I should add, results in all sorts of abuse at the same time, and corruption. And one of the bits of the book that we didn't have a chance to get into is Marion and I go back to the camp to try to unravel this riddle of why was the family ripped apart for so long? Why did it take 30 years for them to be resettled? And part of the answer to that question, it turned out, was a corrupt sort of little ring of people who worked at the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN's migration arm, that were extracting bribes and sexually abusing the people under their control. And so, I think there's both needs to be more oversight within the institutions themselves, the UN agencies, and I think they need more input. Right now, the system, as you well know, it has this kind of hybrid, I guess, more of a bifurcated system of aid workers. There's the full aid workers. Well, there's maybe even really three. There's like the internationals who fly in and get the salaries and the benefits. There's the Kenyans who get like the middle benefits, but don't get treated as equals within the UN bureaucracy. And then there's the incentive workers that are drawn from the drawn from the population of refugees. And they are treated as this kind of perpetual interns that have no prospect of advancement. They get paid, a very nominal amount, because under Kenyan law, they're not allowed to work. Even though these are the people that speak the languages, have the local knowledge, know, how to solve all the problems, they're barred from doing any of the things. So I think a step in the right direction would be extending certainly full employment. I mean, the fact that they don't have employment rights within the confines of the camp, like that's a no-brainer. Like, that's something we should be able to solve. But then I think gradually expanding that to sort of full employment rights in a way to sort of give refugees more of a say in the way that the international community tries to accommodate them.
Okay. We're going to stop there. We've run over the hour. Thank you so much, Ty, for sharing your thoughts and for this wonderful book. I've read it. I'm not just saying this because I know who Ty is. I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's very timely. I think it's very important to put a human face to some of these conversations that we're having. And much like yourself, I when I started writing my book, I had no idea that this would become such an urgent question during the course of the last 2 years. I think right now, refugee resettlement, what are we going to do about the millions of people who are on the move around the world seeking safety? Is probably the most urgent geopolitical question and social question that there is out there. And what I really love and appreciate about this book is that it puts a human face to this question, that it's not just, there is obviously a lot of reporting, there's a lot of facts, there's a lot of heavy lifting in that regard, but then there is also, well, then what does this mean for people? And what does this mean for families? And what does this mean for hopes for their future and dreams? And I really do appreciate that. And I think it's important. So to everybody who's tuned in, I can't recommend this book enough. I hope you pick it up. I hope you pick it up at an independent bookshop. Again, congratulations, Ty. And do you have any last thoughts that you want to leave the audience with? What one thing do you want them to sort of take away from both this conversation, but also maybe from the book?
Yeah, thanks, Nanjala, and thanks again for staying up so late with us. This has been a lot of fun. I guess what I would say is there's one way to read this book, which is as kind of an easy breezy narrative of triumph over adversity and over obstacles. And what I hope people take away from the book is a better sense of the obstacles themselves. I think so many of the things that hold back people like Assad and like Marion prevent them not just from realizing their dreams, but from living dignified lives, are largely invisible to people who are lucky enough not to encounter them. And I think that the insidiousness is in the invisibility and of these things. And so what I've tried to do in the book, I think, is almost to map them, to sort of put them on the page in a way that that acknowledges them. And we were talking a little bit about sort of the heroism of of stories about migration. And you very astutely put it by saying that it's only heroic because we've created this insane sort of network of obstacles that we have to get over. And so I hope what people take away from the book is a clearer sense of what those obstacles are and how they have prevented, really something like 12 million people who are caught in these kind of protracted refugee crises, how it's limited their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does. And I highly encourage everybody who's tuned in, pick it up, tell your friends, tell their friends. Thank you so much, Ty. Thank you for sharing this book with us. Thank you for sharing Assad and Marian's story with us. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in. And I'm going to bed now because it's 2 a.m. Thank you for letting me be part of this, and congratulations. I think it's a wonderful book, and I hope everyone reads it.
Thank you, Nanjala.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.